When I looked at labor law and labor history and 150 years of labor history, what I discovered was that the strike was, as one labor economist said in 1960s, the essence of trade unionism. It's how we make collective bargaining work, meaning how we sit down at the bargaining table and you can have all your flowery words in the world and arguments to try and convince employers. But anyone who sat at the bargaining table, really knows that they don't care about your arguments or your words. And at the end of the day, it's about power. And for working people for most of our history, our power was based on our ability to stop production of the employer and to cause economic harm to employers. And that was really the fundamental strength of us as trade unionists. And it's really how we were able to build a labor movement in this country. So if you look at the private sector trade unionism, which was really the modern movement, was built up in the 1930s and beyond. It was really through the development of an effective strike, which was capable of basically stopping production in entire industries and really forcing employers to come to the bargaining table to recognize unions. The strike was really acknowledged as the way that we won public employee unions in the 1960s. We went from having about 8% of public employees organized into unions in the late 1950s. And it was, most of the contracts that they had were really weak. It was engaging in collective begging rather than collective bargaining. People used to, go to the school board and beg them for money. That's what the unions would do. And they really didn't have power. There were no teacher strikes reported in 1958 whatsoever. And there were, I think it was something like 10 strikes of public employees nationwide in that year. And most of those were short and ineffectual. Yet in the course of a decade, public employees embraced the right to strike. Hundreds of thousands of public workers engaged in illegal strike activity. And in doing so, they did a number of things. Not only did they win unionization in state after state and city after city, through directly striking, forcing the employer to hold an election for recognition, such as New York teachers in 1960. But they also won things like that the public employees had lacked, like pensions and health care and all the things that we've come to appreciate and we're trying to defend for public workers. But even beyond that, and I think this is a lesson I'll go into a little bit more, is public workers through that strike activity were able to force states to legalize bargaining for public workers and even grant public workers the right to strike. So by engaging in often illegal strike activity, confronting labor law directly, and by winning those strikes, they were able to not only win the gains I've mentioned, but in many instances force employers to, and force state policymakers to change the law, to pass the laws in many states upholding the right to strike, and in other states arbitration and so forth.
I have just now directed the activation of the men of the various military organizations to begin in New York City the restoration of essential mail services. These replacements are being sent in as a supplemental workforce to maintain essential services. What is at issue then is the survival of a government based upon law. Essential services must...
Why is it that for most of labor history we had such an effective strike, and the strike was something that employers feared? That's why they, if you said you were going to go on strike and you were prepared, you could win gains at the bargaining table often without even going out on strike. But how did that transform to something that employers started to use in the 1980s and beyond as something to scare workers, to say if you vote for a union, you're going to go out on strike and so forth? And what happened is it's what I call the system of labor control. The strike was transformed from a powerful weapon into something that became ineffectual because basically employers changed the rules of the game. And that's something that I think employers understand far better than trade unionists, is that they understood that, you know, if they won at the bargaining table and they took a hard line, then perhaps they could defeat the union at the bargaining table, or, you know, maybe they'd win, maybe they'd lose. But what they understood is that if they could change the rules of the game in their favor, they could win struggle after struggle. And that's what employers did. Following the great upsurge of the 1930s, they, you know, for a period of time, they were forced to acknowledge trade unions and to recognize unions and to bargain in, you know, often in good faith. But at the same time, they worked relentlessly to undermine labor law. So some of the first efforts were in the late 1930s. Just as, you know, private sector labor law, the Wagner Act, is getting upheld by the Supreme Court, you have a series of decisions which employers are able to use their influence on the court to undercut the right to strike. So you have the McKay Radio decision, which basically says, even though you're supposed to have the right to strike in this country, that you can be permanently replaced for striking. It's you know, often a distinction without a difference, as they say in the law, meaning that yeah, they can't fire you, but they can give away your job to somebody else. So that's not really protective of the right to strike, and that's not really what the statute says. You have a series of decisions such as Fansteel, where they, you know, even though the employer violates labor law, the Supreme Court says that you can't engage in tactics that would actually defend yourself, such as staying in your plant until the employer came to their senses. And that was ruled unprotected, and mass picketing and a lot of other tactics that were essential to trade unionism. So, you know, you can go on with, you know, you have the Taft-Hartley Act, which outlaws solidarity and solidarity strikes. And Supreme Court decisions throughout the 1960s that uphold the ability, or not uphold, it creates the ability of employers to use runaway shops and other business shenanigans to avoid trade unionism. So you basically, what you have over the years is an increasingly tightened noose around the labor movement, that labor law, which originally, you know, at least you can debate what the original purpose is, but originally was used by unions as a form of protection, becomes, by the 1970s, a system of labor control instead. It's a system of labor law that offers very little protection for workers, as anyone who's tried to defend workers' rights in the National Labor Relations Board and get vindication for workers who've been fired. So it provides very little support. Yet on the other hand, it has this web of restrictions which really outlaw effective forms of trade unionism. So when we ask ourselves, why do we have a weak and ineffectual trade union movement today, where only 6 out of 100 private sector workers belong to trade unions, we have to look at the fact that the rules of the game are rigged, and that we cannot revive as a labor movement unless we develop a labor movement capable of confronting these rules. In Strike Back, what I did is I looked at the public employee strike wave of the 1960s. And I did that for a number of reasons. One is because public sector workers are a very important part of the labor movement. Approximately half of the labor movement right now is concentrated in the public sector. In part, that's because the private sector unionism has fallen so far that public sector came out of this as one of the strongholds of trade unionism. Until the last year or two, you know, about 40% of public sector workers were in unions, compared to 6% in the private sector. The second reason that I wrote the book Strike Back was because if you look at the public employee strike wave of the 1960s, it has answers to a lot of questions we face as a labor movement. Because back at the, you know, entering the 1960s, striking was illegal for every public employee group in the nation. All 50 states, it was a felony in the federal government to go on strike, and you could, and people were imprisoned for engaging in strike activity. Yet despite that, hundreds of thousands of public workers in the 1960s successfully confronted labor law. And for us as a labor movement, if we accept the proposition that it's not possible to revive the labor movement in any meaningful way under the existing set of rules, and if we further accept the proposition that it's unlikely, that's an understatement, that we're going to be able to change labor law legislatively through Congress or otherwise or through the courts, then we're really left with one choice, is that we have to, at some point, develop a labor movement that's capable of directly confronting these repressive rules which tie our hands and make trade unionism ineffectual. So rules such as the violations of our right to free speech, where workers are unable to engage in secondary strikes. That means that if you put up a picket sign in front of a related business, you can be held, the union can face injunctions and so forth for engaging in what should be considered to be free speech rights. How was it that workers were able to, and their unions were able to, essentially violate injunctions and violate labor law? And what we find is that, and you can look at quotes from mainstream trade unionists like Jerry Werf from AFSCME, and what he used to say is, once you go out on strike, you can't follow the injunction because if you go back to work without winning the strike, they're going to knock your head off. And the way to win the strike was to stay out there and actually win the strike. And at the end of the strike, a lot of the times what they would do is they would negotiate a return to work. And what unions found, and the fines would go away. And what unions found is that if they had a successful strike that had community support, that had militancy of the workers, that had a number of factors, that was strategic and so forth, that mattered more than whether or not striking was legal. In fact, if you look at labor relations analysts who have extensively studied the question in the 1980s and 90s, they looked back and they said, well, what was the effect of anti-strike laws on strike levels? What they actually found was that workers actually struck more in states where striking was illegal than they did in states where it was legal. And at first that doesn't seem to make sense, but the reality was that the law didn't really govern whether or not workers went out or won their strikes. And in fact, if they made striking illegal, and if you tell an employer the union can't strike or you don't have to bargain with the union, and the union wants to bargain or they want to get a contract, then they're forced to strike because there's no other mechanism to get the employer to reach agreement. And that's indeed what we saw during this period. If the context is right, and you have enough workers in motion, policymakers are faced with a choice. And sometimes we as a labor movement, we always think about the worst case scenario and the repercussions against us, and we have to do that as trade unionists. But what we find is when we have a movement, when we have an upsurge, employers have to make a choice of whether they engage in repression or conciliation. And often if you have enough people in motion, they decide that it makes more sense to reach agreements. So a lot of this is, 20, 30, 40 years ago. More recent example would be in Wisconsin during the Wisconsin uprising, which, a lot of people don't think of it that way, but that really started with an illegal strike. A lot of the grad students, remember back in 2011 when Governor Scott Walker was pushing his anti-union agenda, taking away bargaining rights for public workers. So a lot of the grad students start showing up at the state capitol, but then the Madison teachers get together and they debate and they decide to basically call in what it really is an unauthorized strike. They decide to call in sick and show up at the state capitol. And you would think at the height of the union busting hysteria that was, Scott Walker's Wisconsin, that there would be, a lot of firings because of that, because that was clearly illegal activity. But what you find is that when you have 100,000 people in the streets, you're able to do a lot that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And that's like a mini, more recent example of what we find through labor history. What public employee trade unionists discovered throughout the period was that, you know, militancy by itself was not enough. And basically, what you have is throughout the 1960s, you have high levels of strike activity, really, you know, peaking throughout the late 1970s. But by the mid-1970s, you have something that's very familiar today, which was an organized, conservative, millionaire-driven attack on public employee unionism by the mid-1970s. Public employees start getting blamed for all the ills in society, for the fiscal woes of you know, U.S. cities such as New York and San Francisco. You have the rise of a breed of Democrats who really, like Dianne Feinstein in San Francisco and California, who really cut their teeth on bashing public employee unions. And what you have is public employee unions discover that just doing straight up bread and butter strikes don't work anymore, and that they need to be smarter. And they develop what one guy calls, it was one of the earliest references to it, a public employee social unionism, where they discovered that they really needed to forge deep ties with the community to win public employee strikes. And it was really based on, and this is something that I think is a distinction that needs to be drawn, is that public employee strikes are fundamentally different than private sector strikes. In a private sector strike, the classical purpose of the strike is to stop production or otherwise economically harm the employer. That's what a private sector strike is supposed to do. That's what brings the private sector company to the bargaining table to settle the strike. In a public sector strike, typically, the employer saves money during the strike. And the reason is, let's say you're librarians and you go out on strike. It's not like the employer quits collecting taxes. They're still going to collect all the taxes. They're not going to give a tax rebate to the citizens. What they're going to do is they're going to pocket the money, so they actually make money by the workers going out on strike. What happens is certain services just don't get provided. And this would be a distinction that was extensively drawn in textbooks, and I think it's important for a couple reasons. So basically, in a public sector strike, the way you win is not by economically harming the employer, but by generating enough heat and enough publicity and enough pressure on politicians because of your strike that you force the politicians to settle the strike and make the dispute go away. And that's obviously easier for certain types of public employees than others. But if you look at, for example, the Chicago teachers strike, that would be an example where the strike successfully engaged in broader issues with the community as opposed to just bread and butter issues. And that's really why, that's really a key component of public sector strikes. And the reason it's important to really think about that distinction is because it's essential for public sector unions to win their strikes, whether it's a transit strike or a teacher's strike or whatever it is. But it's also important to be clear-headed in the private sector about what it really means to win strikes. Because a lot of people try and import the idea that, hey, the Chicago teachers strike worked and that had community support, so that's really the essence of winning a private sector strike. And if you accept the distinction that I've drawn here, you'll realize that while it's important for private sector strikes, it's not going to, in and of itself, win the strike. An example would be, what's that town in Wisconsin where they had the poultry? Jefferson, Wisconsin. Anyone remember that strike back in like 2004? It was like outside of Madison a ways. There was this strike in this town called Jefferson, Wisconsin. They took on Tyson, or one of the big poultry companies, and they went out on strike. And they had great community support. Every single person in the community, you went down, you drove into the town, there were signs supporting the strikers. You look at the Detroit News strike, where they had great support from the community. They had all kinds of support. But the reality is, or you look at the Hermel strike in Minnesota, there's tons of places where we've had great support. but we haven't been able to translate that support into economically harming the employer. So that, for that reason, I think we have to understand the importance of community support, but in and of itself, it's not going to revive the trade union movement. A lot of people talk about concepts such as social unionism, which is extremely important, but we have to remember that it's only part and parcel of a set of tactics capable of reviving the labor movement. And the final concept that I want to talk about is really this concept of about labor upsurges, because it's most likely when the labor movement comes back, it's not going to be because of we've won this little battle or that little battle, or we've organized this shop or that shop. It's going to be, if we look at labor history, because hundreds of thousands and millions of workers get into motion. And about 10 years ago, a guy named Dan Clausen wrote a book called The Next Upsurge. And what he argued is that if you look at labor history, most of the time trade unionism is declining. Like most years throughout trade union history, it's on a steady decline, on a little bit of a decline or maybe a steeper decline. So there's these periods where trade unionism grows by leaps and bounds. So the 1930s, trade unionism grows fourfold. From the 1930s up until the mid-40s. Public employees is another example of an upsurge where it grows from 9% of the workforce to 40% of the workforce being organized. And it's a self-generated upsurge. So when we start thinking about how are we going to develop as a labor movement, we need to start thinking about what are the components of an upsurge? How do they work? Why do they develop? It's universally accepted by people who study it that you can't predict an upsurge and you can't make one happen, just like you can't make a general strike happen because you put out a call. But what you can do, and what I argue we can do, is you can figure out the elements that make it more likely than not that it happens, such as delegitimizing labor law, such as having bottom-up grassroots unionism that's capable of forms of resistance. So there's a lot of things we can do as a labor movement that can point us in the right direction.